Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have an entire craft circuit to get through, including events, knitting, spinning, and sewing. So let's get started. So in the past couple of weeks, I have done a couple of interesting things. One was Worldwide Knit in Public Day. I didn't mention it last Casual Friday. It slipped my mind until my calendar alerted me that morning. It's the second Saturday of June every year, so you could put it on your calendar to remind you of it, and you can look up what might be going on, who's hosting an event. This year, locally, we had the Women's Club of Minneapolis was hosting Worldwide Knit and Public Day up on their rooftop. And I didn't even know there was this women's club. It was 100 years old. It's a historic building. They've got a plaque on the outside. And I was just started to ask them questions about this building because there was a sign that said Needlework Guild and there was like an arrow. So I asked them about that, and that was a group within the women's club. It was called a Needlework Guild, and they had sewing machines and sergers, and they would do things like make things for charity. There was knitting, there was all kinds of things going on. And they would make things for various children's hospitals or charities or whatever. And then during COVID, things got locked down, and a lot of the members of that group were elderly and died, or they just stopped doing it. So this was kind of in that spirit of the Needlework Guild, which doesn't exist anymore within the Women's Club. But it was this rooftop with a view of downtown Minneapolis. It was a beautiful day. I met a couple of really interesting women, and it was a lovely time. If you have never participated in Worldwide Knit and Public Day, you can put that on your calendar, second Saturday of every June, every year, and there's a website where you can find out what might be going on near you. If you participated in Worldwide Knit and Public Day this year, I'd love to hear down in the comments what you did to celebrate that event. There's also a Worldwide Spin in Public Day, and that one occurs in September. And I will put on the screen like when that is. It's always the same weekend of September every year. So I'll put that on the screen if that's something you're interested in. The second thing I did that weekend was I volunteered for the Weavers Guild's booth at this American Craft Fest, it's called. And I had heard of this before, but I'd never been to it. I assumed it was a lot of like vendors, and I'm not much of a shopper, even for craft stuff. It's like I need to know what I want, and then I'll go get it. And it's hosted by the American Craft Council, which has its headquarters here in Minneapolis. The event was in St. Paul, the Twin Cities. There's a river between us. But I didn't really know anything about the American Craft Council. It turns out that is another organization that's nearly 100 years old. It first started in New York City. For the past 50 years, they've had events in different cities at St. Paul, Baltimore, Atlanta, and I guess San Francisco. And sometime in the past 10 or 15 years, they moved their headquarters from New York to Minneapolis. They have a library. They used to also have like a museum, and I think that separated from the organization, so there's still this museum in New York, and they support all kinds of crafts. It could be metalwork, it could be ceramics, all kinds of things. So this was a really interesting event. There were vendors there. There was like jewelry, and there was woodworking, and there were all kinds of things. So the Weavers Guild had a booth there, and a lot of these craft booths, not all of them, some of them were just strictly vending, but there were quite a few that had hands-on activities that you could try something. And the Weavers Guild was one of them. We had a floor loom. I think it was an 8-harness floor loom, if that means anything to you, but it's one that folds up and is on wheels, and so it can be transported. And then there was a rigid heddle loom, but a tabletop, a cricket loom it's called. Both of them were warped up, and people could try it out. There'd be somebody who would just be demonstrated very slowly so that they weren't using up all the warp, and people could ask questions and try it out. Then there was a spinning wheel, and that was what I was there to demonstrate, was spinning. and we could answer questions. We could let people try things out. And they also had a table where people could make like a bookmark by wrapping yarn. What it turned out was that it was a lot of families. It was a huge, wide demographic, and really more different than I expected. I expected a lot of middle-aged and older white ladies, and that's not all there was. There was a lot of diversity in the crowd. And a lot of the activities were really geared at children. And so the yarn wrapping thing certainly was. But I had more kids wanting to try out the spinning wheel than adults. And what I learned was how to let them try it out, because I've always demonstrated at the state fair, which is kind of behind a counter, and so people lean over it and they can ask questions, but it's not really accessible because there's a step up and it's a narrow way. So we've stopped letting people at the state fair come behind the counter to try things out, in part because of COVID, and then but also because of the accessibility issue. It isn't fair. But in this situation, it was just a floor, and so anybody would be able to come up. So what I figured out was to let kids try the treadling, and then I would do the drafting of the yarn and kind of explain what it was, and I'd answer questions and people wanting to understand how it worked. There's a lot of people who somehow thought the yarn was coming off of the bobbin and into my hands, which I thought was interesting. But there was one little boy in particular who was really interested in the spinning wheel, and he to the point where then he wanted to try drafting. And so I had to keep my hands on the wool too, and have him, keep his hands behind mine so that he could kind of learn the motions. And he wasn't speaking much, and it was kind of noisy there anyway. He wasn't speaking a whole lot, but he was very attentive and very eager to do it. And his parents, thanked me profusely, and they went off and did something, and I continued demonstrating. And then quite a while later, he came back, and he was really excited, and it seemed like he could speak, but I'm wondering if he was on the spectrum, because he was doing what I would call stimming. He was kind of jumping a lot and maybe a little bit of flapping, and he was showing me, this is what he was showing me. And I said, oh, you did some finger knitting. That's really cool. And he kept holding it out. And I was like, that is so cool. I'm so glad that you were able to do that. And then his parents said, he wants to thank you for showing him how to use a spinning wheel. So that's for you. And so then, oh my God, that was so sweet. First of all, as a knitter, you don't get many knitted gifts. And that was just such a special thing for this little boy to have done. And he did a really good job. His tension is really even, and it's wonderful. So I've been keeping it here on my video recording desk as a little visual reminder of that experience. So as I've been sewing more in the past couple of months, and been really happy that I could switch between sewing and knitting, just like get to a good stopping place in a sewing project and then go back to my desk and do some knitting. That's been really great for me, but I, struggling with how am I going to integrate spinning into this, because the table that's a folding, rolling table that I keep for cutting fabric out, and for I have like a wool pressing mat, and maybe if I just need to pin pieces together, I need this surface out when I'm in the middle of a sewing project, but that sort of interferes with having a spinning wheel out. And that problem got resolved after I went to Maryland Sheep and Wool, and I saw an Eve spinner, and then this lovely viewer, Jean, who was downsizing and was getting rid of hers. She sent that to me, which has been wonderful. And so I have been able to now switch kind of between spinning, sewing, and knitting, which has been really great. And but I'm still, kind of just struggling, figuring out how to balance it. A friend of mine, Elizabeth, who does a really good job rotating between knitting projects as well as spinning and sometimes dyeing and scouring fleeces, depending on the time of year, that kind of thing. she does a really good job with that. And I was talking to her about how I was kind of struggling to try to figure this out. And she said a mutual acquaintance of ours who's a spinner and a natural dyer, and she sews and knits and, you know, does all the things. She does like a craft circuit. So when our spinning group met in the park, we meet once a month, and in the summers it's at a park. And I was asking her how she does it, because I feel like I'm kind of doing it, but I like to hear other people's ideas, because sometimes you're like, oh, that could work for me, and it just, you slightly change what you're doing. And she said she just has goals, like certain projects where she wants to make progress on, and she knows the kinds of things that have to be done on those, and she just makes sure that she does something for that. So it's not like, oh, you're sitting down to sew and you got to spend all afternoon sewing. It's that, oh, I'm going to get the fabric washed, cut out the pattern pieces today or whatever. But it's just something is getting done on it. I'm like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. I've been thinking more about that. And with my e-spinner that I got recently, it's been easier to kind of rotate between sewing, spinning, and knitting, because I don't have to try to get my treadle wheel out of the closet where it's stored while I have the sewing table. That takes up some room while I'm actually working actively on a sewing project. So I can just pull the little e-spinner out and sit it on my desk. That has been great. I know a lot of people have a lot of knitting projects, but a lot of knitters also have other crafts they do. And I'd be interested to hear other people's approaches to how they rotate through things, because I have a lot of good ideas about how to rotate through knitting projects, like all within one type of craft, but it's the bouncing around from one craft to another and making progress that is interesting to me, because at this point I don't have a ton of works in progress for sewing and for spinning and for knitting. With knitting, I gradually, with Finish It February over the years, really got rid of my UFO pile, my unfinished objects pile. And so I usually only have 1 or 2 knitting projects and at a time. And so it isn't like, oh, I can just start working on a different knitting project. I'm really having to think about multiple crafts and what is it that I want to do. So it's really easy for me to get done with a knitting project and then go, oh no, what am I going to knit next? That I'm ready to knit, because right now I have quite a few knitting projects that I have to actually design myself. So I'd be interested to see if any of you have a craft circuit. Like, how do you do that if you have multiple crafts? How do you kind of alternate amongst all of those? So since we're talking about the craft circuit, let's start with knitting. So I showed you a pair of socks I was working on last time for my friend Rosemary. She's a weaver, and we're going to trade. She's making me some hand towels, and I made her a pair of socks. So these are the completed socks. So it's a variegated yarn. The first sock, I think, is this one. And the color was kind of spiraling around, and then it got on the foot, it started zigzagging rather than spiraling. The second one is more of a zigzagger. It's going across, and it comes around here, but then it starts going back the other way. So, you know, this is one of the challenges of variegated yarn. I still think it's really pretty, but it is one of the challenges of variegated yarn, is how are those color is going to play out in the fabric, because it will vary depending on the circumference, whether you're knitting flat versus in the round, how the dye was applied during the dyeing process, all of that kind of thing. The yarn is Acane Fibre Works. It's a fingering weight yarn. It's 80% superwash merino, 20% nylon, so it's appropriate for socks. The colorway is called Whispering Lilac. And it's really worth looking at the different colorways, because he dyes them. It uses different techniques. So sometimes you do get like a spiraling effect. Other times the color is really more dispersed. It just depends on how he applies the yarn. So if you look at his website, you can see he's got the inspiration photograph, usually these really saturated photographs of something that tells him what colors he wants to use in the yarn. And then there's almost always a video that he has on his YouTube channel or Instagram that kind of shows him dyeing that. And then there is a picture of it knitted up so you can kind of see what it's likely to do. But it's done by hand, so there's going to be variation. The next thing I was working on is a mock-up, like a bodice mock-up for a sweater. I recently finished a sweater that I had designed with, it's my first hand-spun sweater. And I designed it top down with simultaneous set-in sleeves, which I've done before, knitting that way and designing that way. And it has worked out successfully. And this time I made some impulsive decisions to change things that made it too big in the shoulders. And they were just dumb decisions because there's also this issue that I lost weight in the past year. And so I'm actually smaller. So a lot of my existing sweaters feel a little bit looser than how I want them to fit. And so I want to fix that sweater at some point, not anytime real soon, but at some point. But mostly what I wanted to do was really nail down how I want something to fit. And so I did the knitting version of a sewing muslin where you just knit the component parts, or so for the knitting mock-up, I knitted the component parts that were really important that I wanted to see how it was going to fit, and then I've been adding to it and I'll be continuing to modify it. And so what I did was this little bodice. It's a crew neck bodice, and I did two types of shoulders. I did a regular shaped, sloped shoulder here, and then on this side I did what Julie Weisenberger calls English tailoring, so that you knit that side all the way up to the shoulder so that it's straight across, and you do a steeper angle across the shoulder. So you have all of the shaping on this one shoulder rather than dividing it amongst the two. And because your shoulders are sloped, that straight edge kind of rolls around at a different rate at the top of your shoulder. So I wanted to see if I liked one shoulder better than the other or if it was the same, because I might make a different decision about which shoulder to use based on stitch pattern. Some just other design choices might make that decision about how I would do the shoulders. And then I wanted to confirm the neck width, like the neck opening, and then once I did the ribbing, for that close fitting neck, how would that fit? Because once you have that, that's sort of like fit ease. Like how much room do I need in order to have something fit and I fit closely? And then I can decide about design ease. Like if I want the neck to be wider or deeper or whatever, how would I modify that in order to make that happen? And with knitting, you also have the issue of the yarn weight, because thicker yarn is going to create a smaller circumference on the inside of the garment. And so you tend to need more ease, and also it has less drape because the yarn is thicker, and so you need more ease. So that's something I've been wanting to figure out as well. So I did the bodice, and then I also wanted to do the sleeve cap shaping, because that was one of the issues that I had with this hand spun sweater, is the sleeve cap shaping was just wrong. And so I went back sort of to the very classic basic shaping, and that fits just fine. The next thing I'm going to do is steek it down the front and figure out how much, if any, extra room I would want in a cardigan that was fitting this closely. So because I designed this bodice to fit me very closely, it might be half an inch bigger, but really it's exactly my full bust size. And if I were to open it up for a cardigan, how much room do I want to make sure that the buttons don't pull and gape. So that will be my next experiment, is to see how that, so this is going to keep going. Thing is, the next sweater that I'm planning on knitting is going to be with a bulky weight yarn. So I have to really think about how much ease do I want to add? And I've been doing some research on this. Usually books will say things like, oh, you need a, this much more ease. And some of that is fashion though. It isn't fit ease, it's design ease. So if you look at the sweaters right now, we've gone from everything being top-down raglan or circular yoke to everything being giant rectangles. And that is absolutely not what I'm interested in for two reasons. One, I lived through that in the 80s and 90s. And once things got into a more fitted silhouette, I'm like, oh, I look a lot better with something that's more fitted. And I just don't want to do the boxy thing again. I don't think it does anything for me, and I know that it will go out of style, whereas something that just fits me reasonably well is not going to go out of style. I might get bigger or smaller, and it might not fit me anymore, but it's not going to be an obvious, oh, that's something from the mid-2020s. So I'm going to be continuing to work on this. With my craft circuit, I had been practicing on my new e-spinner, but I wasn't just like as happy to just pull it out and spin as I was hoping. And I realized the problem was I was just practicing and I needed a project. I pulled out, I have this bin behind me here that has different samples of rare breeds. I did a spinning breed study a few years ago to get myself spinning and trying a lot of different fibers. So I had like a kit. It was 30 different breeds, 1 ounce of each. And so I spun it up and then I knit them into squares and I made this kind of reference blanket. And then on the back, I put these labels that said what kind it is. This is something I take with me at Shepherd's Harvest when I'm volunteering at our Knitters Guild booth, because there's so many different breeds of wool. There are a lot of people who are also spinners, and they can see all of these different breeds at one time and feel them and kind of see what the difference is. So my idea was to keep adding to that. And so I collected a few different samples of other breeds. Sometimes it's raw, and so I have to scour it and then card it and then spin it. And so I've done that. I did some of that last year. And then I also bought some washed locks from Selbu Spinneries. There is a mill there, a yarn mill, and she is really trying to preserve some of their heritage breeds. And you can't ship raw fleece, I don't think, overseas. So she scours it. And I bought some wool that was called Gray Tronder Sow. Sow means sheep, so it's gray Tronder sheep. And is it Trondheim? I think they're like from an area near Trondheim, I believe is correct. They're a colored sheep. They're gray, and then they have this black belly, and they have these like little white teardrop marks under their eyes. And they're a cross between what's called a land race sheep. So it's like sheep that have been there since humans brought them there thousands of years ago. And they were crossed with another breed of sheep. And they were down to about 50 sheep a couple of decades ago. And so they've really been trying to bring them back. And the problem with, colored sheep is that they're not useful for commercial purposes, but spinners like them. So there were different colors of grays. So I got 100 grams of light gray, 100 of medium, and 100 of, I think it's the black from the belly. So I spun up. So this is also still getting used to my e-spinner. I spun up the light gray, and I've got this skein of yarn from it. And it's pretty fine. Like, it was easy to spin pretty fine. This is, I think, ended up being like a sport weight. It's a 2-ply. And then, so the next two that I'm going to do is, and I've carded everything up, This is a little bit darker than this one. They might not seem that different because this is all fluffy, and this is all compressed together, but this is darker. And then we've got the darkest right here, the black right here. So I went through and carded everything, I don't know, a week or two ago. I was a little worried about this light gray because there were a lot of these little yellow flakes in them, and I was worried that it was something called scurf, which is kind of oily and sticky. It doesn't come out of the wool, and it can show that there's like a health issue. So I looked it up because I couldn't remember the name of it and if it was a health issue. And I found a website that said it could be scurf or it could be dandruff. Now, some people will say that dandruff and scurf are the same thing, but this site was saying they're different, and that the scurf isn't going to come out, and the yarn or the wool might break and it just not be good. But dandruff is just going to fall out. And what happened was, as I was picking the locks apart to prepare them to go into the carder, it was just raining down. It was so gross. It was raining down on the table. And then as I ran it through the carder, more of it came out. And so in the end, I think there was maybe a couple of pieces as I was spinning. Oh, then I'd have to stop and just pick it out. But there's none of it left in here. The other two colors didn't have that problem. So because this is light gray and one of them is medium gray, I mean, obviously they could have come from different sheep, but they might have come from a different part of the sheep too. Because the black is on the belly, maybe lighter gray is on the very back, and the medium gray is around the sides. I don't know. It could just be that some are darker than others and they all have black bellies. I have a bit more than I need to make one of those squares, and because I have 3 of them, I'm thinking what I'll do is just make one square with the 3 colors, kind of like a striped thing to show the 3 colors of variation, and then I'll have enough yarn left to make something from these natural colors. I'm not sure what I would make, so that's something I have to think about is what would I make out of a sport weight yarn with 3 colors of natural, 3 natural gray colors. If you have any ideas, leave them down. I'm not a shawl person, although I guess I could do a shawl. Just don't tend to be a shawl person. And it's more than I need for a hat. That's the problem, is probably more than I need for something like a hat, not enough for something like a sweater. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. Speaking of spinning, Tour de Fleece is coming up. So that's an event that happens simultaneously with Tour de France. So while the cyclists' wheels are spinning, spinners' spinning wheels are spinning. And it's sort of like, I think of it as sort of like the spinning equivalent of Finish It February, where you set your own goals. It's not a contest. You set your own goals for what it is you want to do, and you just work at doing that. And I like the fact that it's like the same time of year every year, just like in Finish It February. It's like if I'm fed up with a project and I put it to the side, I know that I will come back to it in February. It's like I don't feel bad about putting it to the side because I know I'm gonna come back to it. And so at the beginning of February, I think about, well, what things am I going to try to finish or repair or modify in order to make them better or to get them done. And so for Tour de Fleece, I'm thinking about what are my spinning goals that I have for this year. Last year was just getting back into spinning. And I also did things like I had a few raw fleeces that I finally learned to scour, and I have a system now for how I scour those fleeces. Haven't spun them yet. So one of my goals this year for Tour de Fleece will be to card the fiber from one of those fleeces and get it ready to spin. Possibly even dye it. Well, one of them is a cream color, and then there's others that one of them is gray and one of them it's a CVM, so there's a couple of different colors. CVM is California Variegated Mutant, so they comes in different colors. For sure, I'll start with the Trondersal and get that spun up. And then there's a dyeing experiment that I want to do. The experiment I want to do is to mix 2 dye colors to get a 3rd color, so that I'm blending them together. And so what I'd like to do is dye some in each of the 2 colors and then dye some other fiber with the two colors mixed together for the dye pot. And then the third experiment would be to spin some yarn when it's in its cream colored state or gray state, whatever, and then dye it once it's turned into yarn. I guess there could be a fourth one where you dye it after it's been knitted up. But the main thing I'm interested in is seeing the difference between the two colors separately and then card them together, blending them together, the two separate colors, versus what it looks like when it's all dyed a solid color. I have a feeling that I'm going to like the blended better, but I'm just curious to see how that works. And then what happens when the yarn is absorbing that color and how it might absorb it in a different way than if it's dyed in the wool. So if it's dyed in the yarn versus dyed in the wool. Oh, the other thing I want to do is, and this might be what I do on the challenge days. There's certain days during Tour de Fleece that are rest days, and then there are a couple of days that are challenge days. And typically the challenge days for the bikers are when they're going up like some mountain, and then the rest day is the day after that. So you can set yourself a particular challenge for those 2 days in spinning. And I think what I would like to do is I have a quill attachment for my e-spinner. And so you can do quill spinning, and that's the kind of spinning you would do on a great wheel. If you've ever seen those, or walking wheel, there's a lot of different names for them, but they're the giant wheel where the spinner has to turn that wheel with her hand, and there's a quill that's sticking out, and you're drafting back in with a long draw with the other one, and then you're coming off at a 45-degree angle, and then you stop the wheel and you line it up so it's perpendicular to the quill so that it can be wound on. And I got to try this last fall. I went to a fiber festival where they had one there to demonstrate, but they were inviting people also to try it. And I tried it out. It's the kind of thing where you really have to develop muscle memory, because you can understand intellectually what you're supposed to do, but being able to do it and being able to continue doing it. Because sometimes you're like, oh, I get it. And then 5 minutes later, it all falls apart because your muscles just aren't used to it, and they kind of get tired, and you have to think so hard about what you're doing. So that is something that I wanted to experiment with, is using that quill. So those are my goals. I don't know if any of you spinners out there are participating in Tour de Fleece. There are like various groups on social media, on Ravelry, Instagram, Facebook, whatever, where people, they might be doing a similar thing or have certain goals, and they have these teams. And again, there's no winners. It's just sharing what you do and seeing what other people do. And I did that last year. I joined a couple of groups, and then I found I'm not interested in reporting back to those people for some reason. So I think this year I'm just setting my own goals, and hopefully I'll be able to get together with some spinning friends here and there, be able to just share the experience that way. The last thing in my craft circuit is sewing. You can see that I'm wearing the shirt that I made earlier this spring, where I thought, oh, it looks kind of like a dental hygienist. And I decided I still like the colors. And I don't know if you can see, I have these pants in my drawer. I love these pants. I usually wear it with a white shirt. But I thought, well, that goes decently, and I won't be invisible when I walk down the street. So that's something. I finished one thing, and then I had to give up another thing. So one of the things is that if I'm wearing something that I've sewn, it's not like an old t-shirt or something, and I'm cooking, I don't want to get spattered. So I thought, I'm going to make myself an apron. It's a reversible apron. Some people call this a Japanese style. I've seen like Claire Saffitz, who's a pastry chef. She's got a YouTube channel. She used to do videos on Bon Appetit. She has this kind of style of apron. It's not reversible, and hers are probably linen, but it's like a one-piece crossover thing. So it's got the crossover right here, and it's got nice big pockets. And this, I just use quilting fabric. I had this fabric right here. It's got all these mathematical equations on it. And then this fabric is fabric I had from making masks, 4 years ago. On this side, I've got the math stuff and the mask fabric. And then there's a little bit of mask fabric up here. And then the other side is just the opposite of this. It's got the mask fabric on the inside with the math equation pockets on it. So I was really happy. It was fun. It was interesting little construction process, and I think it's a clever apron that doesn't require any tying of anything. The other thing was I have been trying different kinds of shirts, like this kind of shirt, and it's got this. You make your own bias binding and you have a go around. I've done a shirt dress that had a collar stand and a collar and a button placket that it gets attached. I did a shirt where it was more like a curved V, but it didn't have a collar on it. But it was a tricky corner to turn, and I learned a lot. And I had buttonholes in it as well, and buttons and buttonholes. And so I've been wanting to try different kinds of shirts and collar constructions. And I thought, I'm going to do like a camp shirt. I went to this, fabric outlet, S.R. Harris, that I've been going to because it's inexpensive fabric. And so when I'm learning something, if it turns out like this and I don't like it, then or it doesn't turn out, like it doesn't work, doesn't fit, then I haven't spent that much money. But if it does turn out, then I have something I can wear. Because I'd never done a camp shirt, and I was reading through the instructions, and there'd be places where I'd have to just stop and have to think about it overnight, because I'm like, it's too late at night, and this is too much of a puzzle. I have to put it to the side. And so I did that one night, and then I got up the next day, and I decided to attach the collar, and I was following all the directions, and then I was attaching this facing on the front and doing all that, and then I got stuck on an instruction when they all came together, and I reread them the next day. I'm like, okay, now I think I know what's going on. And I got everything together, and I'm like, no puckers, no like tucks or whatever. And I had trimmed all my seams and done everything, and then they're telling you to turn the facings inside out. Right side out. And I went to do that. And I'm like, I did something horribly wrong. This is not working. And I had to put it to the side again. And then I came back, a few hours later, and I like to look at, what did I do wrong? How did I sew this together wrong? And the problem was not in how I sewed it together wrong. The problem was that when I sewed the two collar pieces together, I didn't turn them inside out before I sewed them to the shirt. So, and I've trimmed all of these seams, and they were already hard, because trying to avoid puckers, and like, there's no way I'm going to be able to take this thing apart and get it back together. It's just, I can't. And again, it was very inexpensive. I probably spent $6 or something on this fabric. But I got practice with other pockets, and this one has a flap, and I was really happy with how the pockets turned out. I'm actually happy with how the collar turned out, except for the fact that it's inside out. Like, it actually, the notch is there, that worked out. I'm a little concerned about like how much ease there is, because this is either a linen or a linen cotton blend. I'm not sure which. And so it's kind of got some body to it. And I knew that this had quite a bit of ease. It's a camp shirt. It's supposed to be kind of loose. But I'm worried that it's just going to be like standing too big. It's a unisex shirt, so it's for men and women. So instead of wearing like a medium women's, it's a small man's that I'm going for. I think I'm going to go ahead and finish it and see how it fits. So I'm going to use this as my muslin, but I will find out what I think of the sizing, because I kind of feel like the shoulders are a little bit too far off. Just might be a little baggier than I want, and I want to see how I might alter it if I were to make it again. But I've learned a lot about camp shirts, Oh, not to make one. You know, I don't feel like it's a lost cause when I learn something, because how often have I knit something just to learn from it? Or I knit one stocking, I'm not making a pair. I'm making entire sweaters to learn something about construction of sweaters in the 1930s. The main thing that's important to me in my life is learning something new every day. And now I've learned to make sure to read the instructions where it says to turn the collar right side out. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.